Do you know the most powerful, most important business skill of the 21st century? If not, stay tuned.
Welcome to How to Get What You Want. This podcast is for driven women ready to claim their goals and navigate their careers with clarity and confidence. Join me as we explore real stories, tools, and strategies to help you steer your career exactly where you want to go. Let's get started on helping you get what you want. Hey, welcome. I'm so glad that you made the choice to be here today because I have a really good friend of mine, a newer but very good friend of mine, Dr. Melissa. We met in Ohio a few months ago in a hallway.
We did. In a hallway.
That's a true story.
It sounds so glamorous.
Actually, you were the keynote speaker, and I was so blown away by the concepts and because they're so parallel to what I talk about, but I just loved your brilliance. So tell us about you.
Well, thank you for having me. I take it very seriously to be trusted with minutes like this. So my name is Melissa Briggs Phillips. My peeps call me Dr. M because that's a lot of syllables. I am a psychologist with a circuitous career path. So I think that is the easiest way to sum up my journey. After I finished my PhD, I was 27 and I took a job as a project director, and I was handed handful of undergraduates, graduate students, community volunteers. I was asked to negotiate a memorandum of understanding with a huge healthcare system and a 3-inch binder and $3 million. And they said, make this real. And I fell in love with operations. So my main job has been in operational leadership in a variety of sectors for about 15 years, which is very atypical for a trauma therapist and psychologist. So I always taught as an adjunct and had part-time clinical work throughout my career. And then about 10 years ago, I decided to fuse those two lanes together. So I have my own practice where I work with executives and leaders as kind of a coach, but informed from my perspective as a therapist. And I do teaching and training now, not so much in a classroom with college kids anymore, but on a stage or with a small group in a corporate or organizational context. So that's a little bit about me. So I have certain things that I love to talk about, like psychological flexibility.
Woohoo, let's talk about it. All right. Well, tell us a little bit about it.
As a, vintage trauma therapist, I have spent years, probably tens of thousands of hours at this point, listening deeply to people who have been through just experiences that take your breath away. And I also have had the opportunity to sit in rooms with leaders who are really rumbling with making a big decision or struggling with integrating their professional and their personal life, or needing to make a tough call with someone on their senior leadership team and they just can't get it over the finish line. And the skill set, the psychological capacity skill sets for both of those groups mirror each other. And over these last few years, I've thought, how can we teach and talk about psychological flexibility? What is this? And I've called it various things: mental toughness, grit. We've called it all kinds of things. There's a newer research study that came out maybe 2 years ago that looked at over 54,000 studies, like a meta-analysis, a literature review, and psychological flexibility was the biggest determinant of all kinds of wellness outcomes in people's lives. And I thought, that's it. That's it. I think I can give people a framework. And I had, without really calling it a behave forward framework that's all about psychological flexibility. And so that is what I have been thinking about teaching and training for these last 2 or 3 years, very specifically.
Yeah.
And so, does that help? Does that kind of
totally
share the narrative?
Yeah. And it's so aligned with when you're a negotiator, you need to have psychological flexibility to be able to maneuver because the table's always changing. There's always somebody different on the other side. There's different conditions. High stakes could be a person that shows up that it was unexpected and being able to flex through that. So when we come back, I'd love for you to even share with us some contextual stories of some of your clients, and then we can figure out how to apply it from there. So we'll be right back. So Dr. M, tell us, you had just said you just had a recent example that you want to share.
All right. So I'll give your listeners a visual. Okay. So the first thing I want to share is I want you to imagine like 4 tiles, like four grids. Okay. And it's you. Okay. I want you to think about you. We think stuff. We feel stuff. We have a body. This is our container we get to be a human in. And then we do behaviors. Okay. So I want you to think about these grids.
So all those are in one tile. Like,
and one, like, sort of like we think stuff. We feel stuff. We have a body this is our container, and it tells us stuff sometimes.
Yeah.
And then behavior, which is the most important piece of those 4. It's behavior. And I think when I was reading your book, I was sort of vibing on this idea of negotiation really is about a behavioral output. And you can think a bunch of stuff that might be inaccurate. You can feel a bunch of stuff that might be unproportional to the situation. You know, your body can kind of betray you, right? Your heart gets going, the pulse goes up. Yeah. Behavior is human currency. It is how we transact with each other. And so psychological flexibility allows you to kind of toggle around on those 4 tiles with strategy, fullness, and intention. So I just had an executive literally leave my office 20 minutes before we jumped on this call. And she had a situation where she's a leader on a volunteer board. It is 100 women that are leaders within their sector and had always loved it. It had been an emotional safe space for her. And somebody new joined who was clearly intent on bringing drama, chaos, and conflict. Read some of the emails, shared some of the texts, like, here, just you look at this. And she said, I am dysregulated. I am all over the place. It is my job to get this particular project over the finish line. I literally sat in my pants all week. I mean, this is a powerful woman. Okay. She does not sit in her sweatpants over the weekend. Yeah. And so we were able to kind of very quickly, because I know her deeply, pull at this and go, okay, the primary pain point here, you're used to being able to say things in a logical way and get a logical response. You are very used to quickly getting an efficient reaction out of somebody, driving something that is logical. And instead it was drama, chaos, conflict, emotion. And you just kept going at it with logic. This is your family system. Like, you are the person in the family that does this, and you're growing weary of it and you're exhausted. So it's the same emotional pain point for you going on in this negotiation with this team. And she hadn't connected those dots. She was like, oh my gosh, it is the same thing, different packaging, but it's the same primary pain point. It's this emotional piece that threw her off her game. So we were able to like frame it up. I gave her some definitions of what she was dealing with, and she left with an action plan and a lot more confidence. She wasn't crazy. Like, you know, when we all know what that feels like when you go, wait a minute, I am not having a proportional response to this. Yeah. And it's frequently when it's touching that emotion square where you're just kind of a raw nerve ending about something and you don't know why. But psychological flexibility and using pretty sophisticated negotiation tactics can help you save the culture and the team from something like that.
What comes to mind for me is that situation became high stakes. And it's almost sometimes high stakes is we don't recognize it. But what happens is it becomes emotional. Now there is a contributing factor that was added that changes literally our physical response. Mm-hmm. And that can be a way to identify it. And being able to go, okay, this is high stakes for me. I need to zoom out, because so often when I see people, they get zoomed in on this one thing and they can't have that objectivity anymore.
You probably see it all the time. Mm-hmm. And it's and I don't know, in negotiation tactics, what you might call it, psychologists would call it cognitive distancing strategies, mm-hmm. where you're exactly right. You need to have some distance from it. And it's very powerful to have those. And there's probably a dozen. When I work with clients, there's probably I probably have a pull and play list of different cognitive distancing strategies that help with that, because you zoom in and it's mm-hmm. almost always an emotional tender spot for somebody, and you got to honor it, but not let it get so sticky. You can honor it's there, but then that's called the pivot, where you go, oh, there it is. There's that tender spot. You put your hand on your chest. Like I will tell clients, thank your body for just
Yes.
telling you something was going on. Like, just put your hand on your heart and go, okay, thank you, but I don't need your service anymore. When people feel panicky or dysregulated, if you fight it, if you're doing this, like that, you got to pivot. You can't usually take it on directly.
When you said that, I can think of so many times when I was an executive where my peer Dan would come into the room and it was just anything he said, I would just say no to, because we had this history, we had this relationship, and I just didn't have high level of trust. And it's so interesting how it can just take over your entire ability to be rational.
Yeah. And when I'm sitting with folks, I'll say, okay, there's an inside story and there's an outside story. Like, so what's the outside story? Is there a way for us to interrogate that as factually as possible? Maybe Dan's an idiot. Maybe Dan's a jerk. Maybe Dan is licking the boots of the people above him. And so he's got all this political capital you don't have. And you know that. And so anything he says, you're like reading the room appropriately. Maybe that's an outside story that's accurate or not. Or maybe he doesn't have that power, or he doesn't, and you're sort of like interpreting things that maybe aren't accurate. Or maybe it's an inside story because a Dan showed up when you were 15 or 20 or 25, and it's not Dan. It's Uncle Joe or my dad or my grandfather or somebody else that is like part of the inside story. Mm-hmm. And so who knows, maybe offline, you and I will workshop that.
I love this idea of the inside outside story. I find myself writing notes whenever I talk to you and being able to recognize so that you can zoom out and look at it. Because in those moments when you are thankful to your body, that means to me when I talk to my clients is that means you need space. You need to really take some time or just identify, all right, I'm triggered right now. So the decisions I make right now might not be in my best interest later, even though it might feel good in the moment.
Absolutely. And I will ask folks, like, when do you make your best decisions? And no one ever says, when I am white hot with rage.
Exactly.
Or I'm starving, or, we have these, all of us have these like human vulnerabilities where we're not making our best decisions because we're activated. And that self-awareness thing that helps you like know, like if you're on the ramp, I call them off ramps and on ramps. Like if you self-awareness, you can go, oh, I've been on this on ramp before. This is not going to be good to try and exit sooner. And it takes practice. It's just a set of practices where you're really attuned to what's going on for yourself.
It's a perfect segue. When we come back, you're going to give us some tips that we can use to get on that off ramp as soon as we can. We'll be right back. Dr. M, give us 3 tips that we can start using.
The practice of self-awareness is an ongoing thing. It isn't a destination. Mm-hmm. It is not a thing you get a score on. It is a set of practices that you remain committed to. So the first thing I want to do is frame that for people as not a place you arrive. It's a belief that it is something that is an important practice. And so you're committed to it. So one of the first things I like to have people do, and it's very fun to have folks do this, is to say, okay, I want you to pick 3 to 5 loving critics and ask them to tell you, and you could fill in the blank. Why did they decide to be in relationship with you? Why did they decide you were a good friend and remain open to that? Why did they hire you? It can be, and then in a professional or a personal context, it can be about like, what should be on my dating profile? That's one of my favorite things that I love to ask, even if people are partnered, to say, have your 3 best friends write your dating profile and see what they come up with.
I love that.
So to have, it's always better than what people write themselves. To have people who are loving critics, meaning they will be candid with you, but also they love you and see you maybe objectively in ways you don't see yourself. So the 5 loving critics exercise around any domain. If you feel stuck, having somebody give you some feedback around that, inviting that can feel super vulnerable, but it's helpful. Really is.
That's a good one. That's fun too.
So 5 living critics.
Number 2.
Okay. So I think that an active self-awareness practice has to include some sort of emotional housekeeping. And so this can take all kinds of shapes. The primary pain point, like going back to a time when you have a vivid memory about something that was deeply emotional, and getting a wheel out that it has a bunch of feeling words on it. I have this wheel of feelings. You can Google it. Wheel of feeling. And writing out that story. This is this thing that happened, and here are the emotions I felt. Most of the time, when you are your worst version of yourself, it touches that betrayal, abandonment, neglect, anger, indignation, restlessness, boredom. When you are your worst version of yourself, it's going to be in a bundle that's adjacent to that emotional experience. So knowing you have a tender spot there can help you when you go into a high stakes negotiation. Because if the person across the table is going to bring up some of that, you want to know ahead of time so you can do some emotional housekeeping. I also think it is very helpful for you to do a feeling wheel practice like 5 days in a row, 5 to 7 times a day. Like, what are you feeling? What is your emotional landscape over the arc of a day? Because when the emotions get dysregulated is usually when we make our worst decisions, as we discussed. So a final self-awareness practice can be a thinking thing. So it can be more about, okay, the story I'm telling myself right now is this. And it doesn't have to be when it's high stakes or it's like fraught situation. It can be, this is the story I tell myself about the house I live in, or the neighborhood I chose, or this company that I want to work for. Just doing some extra interrogation around your intentions and your choices, which is not an emotional thing, it's a thinking thing, can just keep you in practice. It's like a muscle to flex over and over again. What else might be possible? What else might be happening? What else might be true? Like the capacity to ask those questions those aren't emotional things. Those are thinking things. And I think culturally, we could all use this too. We tend to kind of be doing this cognitive cheat of we like bifurcate everything and just sort it into good, bad, red, blue. And like humans are not that. They are so layered and so complicated. It's a good practice to ask what else could be going on here.
Oh, that's so good. Okay. So the first one was interviewing somebody else to give you
5 loving critics. So
5 loving critics.
3 to 5 loving critics.
Yep.
Write your dating profile or tell you a story of why they picked you to be in relationship with them.
So
what do they believe?
Yep.
Yeah, from the outside. So that's an outside story thing coming in. A second thing would be a primary pain point. That's my PPP is a primary pain point. Way back, childhood, adolescence, a pivotal moment that was highly emotional. Is that still stuck in there somewhere? And then a third thing is a thinking exercise of asking yourself why you are choosing the things you're choosing. Kind of the big why. Why do I live here? Why did I pick this? Just keep asking why and asking what else might be possible. What else could be going on? And it's a way of flexing curiosity. There's a new study that came out that said enthusiasm and curiosity are 2 of the personality variables correlated with mental health outcomes, like enthusiasm and curiosity. And that comes from asking questions. We don't ask questions from a place of curiosity.
Oh, I love that. Oh, so good. It's like you're getting perspective on your world from the outside, from your feelings, and from just being an observer and getting evidence about why you're where you are. Oh, Dr. M, this has been so great. I can't even believe it's just like flown by. And I feel like I'm really going to use those tips to think about myself from all those different angles. And I love what you said too about just the continuum that self-awareness is not a destination. It really is something you need to practice. Actually, the research that I've read says that as you go up in an organization, it decreases because you get less feedback.
Oh yeah. And I think we talked about that in our hallway conversation. Yes. If memory serves. There are the 3 variables that get in the way of self-awareness are experience. The more experience you have, the better you think you are at something when that may not be accurate. Power, because in structures, people are less likely to tell you the truth because of fear of retribution. I see that a lot. And introversion, which is stunned me. But if you ask introverts, they will tell you, I'm very self-aware. I'm like, well, you're very aware of like what's in your inside story, but maybe not so much the outside story or the interaction effect of both. So there are ways to mitigate all of those with an active self-awareness practice. I ask executives all the time, like, who tells you the truth? And I will have them tell me, I think you might be the only person in my life that tells me the truth.
Yeah.
I've had several people, because there's no fear of retribution for me to say, I think you did that because you were trying to exact revenge on your little brother who made that decision on the board. And I think it was a bad business decision and no one's going to tell you. And because there's no consequence for me. So finding an accountability partner who will be your reliable narrator. We cannot be trusted. And sometimes our girlfriends, sometimes our partners or lovers can be reliable narrators, but always. So I highly encourage people to find somebody who can serve in that capacity to be the reliable narrator.
I love that so much. And it can't be your mom. Nope. It can't be somebody that loves you deeply. It has to be somebody that has an eye for maybe contextual understanding of your industry or something.
Absolutely.
But somebody that's going to really be honest, but is not close to it. So they have a conflict of interest.
Yeah, exactly. A reliable narrator that doesn't have a stake in the outcome and is truly only invested in your well-being.
Well, tell us how people can connect with you.
So I am in Columbus, Ohio. And I have essentially 2 practices. BehaveForward.com is my kind of more traditional presenting, teaching, talk therapy practice. And I have a couple of people that work for me in that practice. And then I opened, because I am such a psychological flexibility proselytizer, last year I opened Mindset Ketamine, which is an integrated ketamine practice, which is kind of adjacent to psychedelic assisted therapy, where we are an integrated practice where the ketamine infusions happen in office and you are working with a therapist. And so we work with business leaders. We work with folks that have a lot of big trauma. It's sort of an innovative way of growing psychological flexibility. I can be found on LinkedIn, so you can find me there too.
Awesome. Thank you so much for being here.
Welcome.
So much value, so much wisdom. Always, always. So appreciate you. Thanks for joining us. And remember, negotiation is more than a skill. It's a mindset. Until next time.